I gave them everything. The house, the land, the savings, every single thing they demanded. They thought they had already won, but when the lawyer reached the last line of the will, his face went completely white. And for the first time in years, my family finally realized they never understood me at all. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Storyflow Diaries. I never thought the people who shared my last name would one day sit across from me like strangers calculating my value. But life has a way of revealing hearts when money enters the room. My name is Margaret, and at 72 years old, I learned a lesson about family that most people are lucky never to face. The strange thing is, the story everyone tells about what happened is wrong. They say I humiliated my own children. They say I tricked them. They say I planned revenge. But the truth is quieter than that, and far sadder. The truth is that I gave them exactly what they asked for, every single thing. And somehow, that became the worst shock of their lives. It started after my husband Daniel passed away. 46 years of marriage ended in a hospital room that suddenly felt too silent. Anyone who has lost someone like that knows the strange emptiness that follows. You expect your children to fill some of that silence. At least I did. Daniel and I raised 3 of them, Michael, Laura, and Ben. When they were small, our house was loud with laughter, slammed doors, and late-night homework at the kitchen table. Back then, I believed what most parents believe, that love you pour into children eventually circles back. That belief stayed with me longer than it probably should have. At the funeral, they cried. Of course they cried. Anyone watching would have thought we were a close family. Michael held my shoulders like a protective son. Laura kept saying, "Mom, you're not alone." Ben squeezed my hand like he used to when he was little. For a few weeks after the funeral, they visited often. Food appeared at my door. They helped with paperwork. They spoke softly around me like I might break. And maybe that's why what happened later felt so confusing, because cruelty rarely begins with shouting. It begins with small changes, small tones, small looks. The first crack appeared on a Sunday dinner about 2 months after Daniel passed. I had cooked too much food like I always did. Old habits survive grief. The 3 of them sat around the dining table I had polished for decades, and for a moment I almost felt normal again. Then Michael cleared his throat in that careful way people do when they are about to introduce something unpleasant wrapped in politeness. He asked if I had thought about future arrangements. I didn't understand at first. My mind was still somewhere between memories and loneliness. Then Laura explained it more clearly. She said the house was a lot for one person. Ben mentioned property taxes. Michael talked about planning ahead. The conversation sounded practical on the surface, but something underneath it made my stomach tighten. It wasn't concern, it was calculation. Parents know the difference. Still, I stayed calm. I asked what exactly they meant. That's when Michael leaned back and said something that would quietly echo in my mind for months. He said, "Dad worked hard for all this. We just want to make sure things are handled fairly." Fairly. It's a curious word when spoken by someone already imagining what belongs to them. Over the following weeks, the visits changed. They came less often to sit with me and more often to discuss assets, the house value, the savings Daniel left behind, even the small cabin by the lake that we bought 30 years ago after saving every spare dollar. Conversations that once began with, "How are you doing, Mom?" became, "Have you thought about what happens if?" I tried not to see what was forming, but the human heart isn't blind forever. One evening after they left, I sat alone in the living room where Daniel used to read the newspaper, and I realized something painful. They weren't worried about me being alone. They were worried about what might happen to what I owned if decisions weren't made quickly. It sounds harsh to say out loud, but grief strips away the lies we tell ourselves. And once you see something clearly, you cannot unsee it. Still, they were my children. That fact alone can keep hope alive longer than logic ever would. So when Michael suggested we all meet with a lawyer to organize things, I agreed. I told myself it was responsible. I told myself it would ease their worries. Deep down, though, another feeling had begun growing quietly inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something more observant than that. Something patient. The meeting was scheduled 3 weeks later. In those 3 weeks, I noticed things I had ignored before. Whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Laura asking oddly specific questions about account numbers. Then walking around the house like he was measuring walls with his eyes. I remember standing in the kitchen one afternoon while they spoke on the back porch, unaware I could hear them through the open window. Michael said very plainly, "If we don't settle this now, everything could get complicated later." Laura replied, "She'll agree. She always does." They were talking about me like I wasn't a person anymore, like I was paperwork waiting to be signed. That was the moment something shifted in my chest. Not a dramatic snap, just a quiet understanding settling into place. I realized my children believed they already knew how this story would end. They believed I was predictable, soft, easily guided. And in a way, they weren't wrong. I had spent my entire life giving them what they needed. But what they never learned was that patience and weakness are not the same thing. The day before the lawyer meeting, Michael called me and asked if I had thought about how to divide things. His voice sounded casual, but underneath it was excitement he couldn't quite hide. I smiled into the phone, even though he couldn't see it. I told him to not worry. I said I had made a decision. There was a pause on the line, and then he laughed in relief. He said, "That's great, Mom. This will make everything easier." I remember looking around the quiet house after that call ended. The photographs on the walls, Daniel's chair by the window, the life we built piece by piece. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt something almost like clarity. Because they were right about one thing. I had made a decision. I was going to give them everything they wanted. When people hear what happened later, they imagine that I stormed into that lawyer's office with some grand plan already burning in my mind. But the truth is quieter than that. I slept very little the night before the meeting. The house felt too big again, the same way it did right after Daniel passed. I walked from room to room, touching small things that held memories. The edge of the piano where Laura used to practice, the hallway wall still marked faintly from the year Ben crashed his bicycle into it, the kitchen counter where Michael once stood proudly, showing me a report card he thought would disappoint me, but didn't. Memories have a way of reminding you that love was real, even when the present starts to feel unfamiliar. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. Where had we lost each other? Was it sudden, or had it been happening slowly for years while Daniel and I believed everything was fine? Parents don't get manuals explaining when affection turns into expectation. Sometimes the shift is so gradual that you only notice once it has already settled in. Around 3 in the morning, I sat at the dining table with a cup of tea that had long gone cold, and I realized something else that surprised me. I wasn't angry the way people might assume. I was disappointed, yes, hurt in ways I hadn't expected from my own children. But anger requires heat, and what I felt was colder than that, clearer. It was the calm understanding that the next day would reveal exactly who they had become. Morning arrived slowly. The sunlight through the curtains looked ordinary, which almost felt strange considering how heavy my thoughts had been. I dressed carefully, not because anyone would notice, but because Daniel always used to say important days deserved respect. When I looked in the mirror before leaving, I saw someone older than the woman I remembered being a few years earlier. Grief had a way of doing that. But behind the tiredness in my eyes, something else had appeared too: resolve. The lawyer's office was across town in a building Daniel and I had visited only once before when we first wrote our will many years ago. I remember sitting in the car for a moment before going inside, listening to the quiet tick of the engine cooling. For a second, I almost wished Daniel were beside me the way he used to be during difficult conversations. He had always been better at reading people. But life doesn't pause just because we wish someone were still here to guide us. Eventually, I stepped out and walked inside. They were already there, waiting. Michael stood when he saw me, smiling with that same confident expression he had worn since his early 20s, the one that always suggested he believed things would naturally go his way. Laura gave me a quick hug that felt polite but distracted, as if part of her attention was already focused on what the meeting might bring. Ben nodded from his chair with a look that tried to appear relaxed but didn't quite succeed. The lawyer greeted me warmly and asked if I was comfortable before we began. His tone was professional but kind, the way people speak when they sense family tension sitting quietly in the room. Papers were arranged neatly across the table. Pens waited nearby, like small, silent witnesses. At first, the conversation was ordinary. He asked about Daniel's previous arrangements, whether anything had changed, whether I had specific wishes moving forward. I could feel my children listening carefully to every word, though they tried to appear casual. It reminded me of students pretending not to care about the result of a test they secretly fear. When the lawyer asked if I had thought about how I wanted to distribute my estate, the room became so quiet that even the faint hum of the air conditioner sounded loud. I looked at each of my children before answering. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no raised voices, no accusations, just a mother studying the faces she had known longer than anyone else in the world. Michael's eyes held anticipation he tried to hide. Laura's fingers tapped lightly against the table. Ben avoided looking directly at me, but his attention never drifted far. In that moment, I understood something very important. They weren't villains in their own minds. They believed this conversation was simply the natural order of things. Parents age, assets pass down, life moves forward. Somewhere along the way, they had stopped seeing the emotional weight behind it all. I spoke calmly when I finally answered. I told the lawyer that yes, I had made decisions. I told him my children were right about one thing: the future should be organized clearly so there would be no confusion later. The relief on Michael's face appeared so quickly it almost felt boyish. Laura leaned back slightly, tension leaving her shoulders. Ben exhaled like someone who had been holding their breath. Watching those reactions hurt more than I expected, not because of greed alone, but because none of them asked what the decision meant for me. The lawyer nodded and began writing notes. He asked a few careful questions to make sure my wishes were precise. I answered each one slowly, choosing my words with care. The house, the savings, the lake cabin, even the smaller things Daniel and I had collected together during our life together. With every detail confirmed, the sense of expectation in the room grew stronger. My children exchanged quick glances that carried quiet excitement. At one point, Michael even gave a subtle nod to Laura as if confirming a prediction they had discussed privately. I noticed everything, though I pretended not to. Years of motherhood train you to read a room without announcing it. When the lawyer finished writing, he looked up and asked if I was certain about everything. I told him yes. My voice didn't shake.
Inside, however, memories kept rising like distant echoes. Birthday parties, scraped knees, school plays, the thousand invisible sacrifices parents make without keeping score. I wondered if any of those moments were passing through their minds too. Judging by their expressions, probably not. Before we ended the meeting, the lawyer explained that the final documents would need to be prepared properly and read again before signing. Michael immediately asked how long that would take. The question came too quickly, like a child asking when presents can be opened. The lawyer gave a small smile and said it wouldn't be long. We stood up from the table after that, chairs sliding softly across the floor. Laura hugged me again, this time with more warmth than earlier, then told me everything would be simpler now. Michael put a reassuring hand on my shoulder and said he was glad we handled this responsibly. I nodded and thanked them for coming. On the surface, it looked like a peaceful family moment, but as we walked out of that office together, I felt the same quiet clarity that had settled over me the night before. They believed the story was moving exactly as they expected. They believed I had just secured their future in the most straightforward way possible. And technically, they were right, because I had agreed to give them everything they wanted. What none of them realized yet was that they had only heard the beginning of the arrangement.
The strange thing about life is that the most important decisions rarely look dramatic from the outside. After the meeting with the lawyer, we walked out into the parking lot together like any ordinary family finishing an appointment. Cars passed on the street. Someone across the road laughed into their phone. The world continued exactly as it always does, unaware that a quiet shift had just taken place inside me. Michael offered to drive me home, but I told him I preferred to go alone. He didn't argue. In fact, he seemed distracted in the way people are when their mind is already celebrating something ahead of time. Laura said she would call later in the evening. Ben waved before heading toward his car. Within a minute, they were gone. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, holding my purse with both hands, looking up at the gray office building windows. For a brief second, I wondered what Daniel would have thought if he had been there listening to the conversation. My husband had always been a patient man, but he also had a quiet sense of justice about him. He believed people should reveal who they are before you decide how to respond to them. That thought stayed with me the entire drive home. When I walked into the house, the silence greeted me again, but this time it didn't feel as heavy. I took off my coat and hung it beside Daniel's old jacket, which I still hadn't moved from the rack. The habit of leaving things as they were had slowly become a comfort. I made myself tea and sat at the kitchen table, where sunlight stretched across the wood in long, soft lines. For a while, I simply watched dust float in the air and allowed my thoughts to settle. Many people assume that moments like these are filled with plotting or anger, but what I felt was something else entirely. I felt curiosity, not about money or documents, but about my children. I wondered how far their expectations truly went, whether they had already begun discussing what each of them would do once everything became theirs. It's a strange experience realizing that the people you raised are now imagining life after you, not necessarily wishing for it, but preparing for it. I don't think they even understood how clearly it showed. Over the next week, their behavior answered many of my questions without them realizing it. Michael started calling more often, but our conversations had a different tone now. He spoke in careful phrases that sounded supportive while subtly guiding topics toward the future. One afternoon, he mentioned how expensive home renovations had become lately. Another time, he talked about investment opportunities in property. Laura sent me several messages asking if I needed help organizing old items around the house. She said it might be good to start simplifying.
Ben was quieter than the other two, but even he began asking questions about the cabin by the lake. At one point, he joked that he might finally fix the broken dock if it ever belonged to him. I listened to all of it patiently, responding with small smiles they couldn't see through the phone. None of them noticed that I rarely volunteered new information. I simply observed. When you stay quiet long enough, people reveal their true thoughts more freely than they expect. One evening, Laura came over for dinner, just the two of us. She brought a pie from the bakery down the street and placed it on the counter like a peace offering, though there had been no argument between us. We ate slowly while talking about ordinary things, the weather, her children, a television show she had started watching. For a while, it almost felt like the past again. Then gently, the conversation shifted. She asked if the lawyer had given me a timeline for finishing the paperwork. The question came in such a soft tone that someone less attentive might have missed the importance behind it. I told her it would probably be ready soon. She nodded thoughtfully and took another bite of pie. After a moment, she said something that stayed with me long after she left. She said, "You know, Mom, it's better when families settle these things clearly. It prevents resentment later." The irony of that sentence sat between us on the table like a quiet guest. I looked at her face, searching for any hint that she understood how strange the situation had become, but she seemed completely sincere. In her mind, she was helping maintain harmony. Later that night, after she drove away, I walked through the hallway, turning off lights one by one. The house felt different lately, almost as if it knew something important was approaching. I paused beside the living room window where Daniel used to sit every evening. For years, he had watched the same stretch of street, greeting neighbors and waving at passing children riding bikes. I remembered a conversation we had there once, long before any of this happened. Michael had been about 16 at the time and had gotten into trouble for lying about where he spent an evening. I was upset and asked Daniel if we had failed somewhere as parents. Daniel had smiled gently and said something I didn't fully understand until much later. He said, "People don't show their real character when everything is comfortable. They show it when they think there's something to gain." At the time, I thought he was simply defending our son from a teenage mistake. Standing there years later, those words echoed differently. The lawyer called 3 days later to say the documents were ready for review. His voice sounded normal, professional, unaware that the simple message carried so much weight. We arranged another meeting for the following week so everything could be read and signed properly. After hanging up, I sat quietly with the phone still in my hand. I imagined my children hearing the same news soon, the anticipation in their voices, the confidence that everything was unfolding exactly as expected. And in many ways it was, because I had never lied to them. I truly intended to give them what they wanted: the house, the savings, the land, everything Daniel and I built over decades of careful work. Some people might wonder why I didn't confront them directly or demand gratitude or remind them of all the years behind those possessions, but forcing people to act grateful rarely creates real understanding. Sometimes the only way for someone to see themselves clearly is to let them walk confidently toward the truth waiting ahead. The morning of the second meeting arrived colder than the previous week. Winter had begun creeping into the air, carrying that sharp stillness that makes every sound seem clearer. When I arrived at the lawyer's office again, my children were already seated just like before, but this time their energy felt different. There was an excitement beneath their calm expressions, the quiet belief that the final step of a long process was about to happen. The lawyer greeted us and began arranging the papers in front of him. Thick documents, careful language, official stamps, the kind of things that make people feel certain about the future. As we all settled into our chairs, he adjusted his glasses and said he would read through the key parts aloud so everyone understood them fully before anything was signed. Michael leaned forward slightly. Laura folded her hands neatly. Ben shifted in his seat but kept his eyes fixed on the stack of papers. I sat back and listened, because the truth was, the moment they had been waiting for was finally about to begin.
The lawyer began reading in the calm, steady voice of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. Legal language has a rhythm to it, almost like a slow mechanical heartbeat. Names, dates, formal phrases repeating themselves with careful precision. At first, nothing seemed unusual. He confirmed my full name, Daniel's name, the history of the estate, and the fact that this document replaced our previous arrangements. My children listened closely, though they tried to appear patient rather than eager. I could see it in small ways. Michael's fingers resting too tightly on the edge of the table, Laura nodding slightly every time a property was mentioned, Ben glancing at the pages as though he might somehow read ahead. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the same calm that had settled over me days earlier. It was the calm that comes when you have already made peace with your decision. The first sections were exactly what they expected. The lawyer explained that the house would be transferred to my children. He listed the savings accounts Daniel and I had built over decades. He mentioned the small investments we had made and the lake cabin that had been part of so many summers. Every time something familiar appeared in his reading, I could almost feel the atmosphere in the room warming with satisfaction. Michael leaned back at one point, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly like someone who had just watched a prediction come true. Laura's eyes softened with relief. Even Ben looked more relaxed than he had since we walked in. If someone had taken a photograph of that moment, it would have looked like a responsible family calmly settling their future, and technically that's exactly what it was. But stories rarely revealed their full meaning in the first few pages. As the lawyer continued, he paused occasionally to confirm that everything sounded correct to me. Each time I nodded. My children seemed to take that as confirmation that the process was nearly finished. I noticed Michael check his watch once, not impatiently, but with the quiet confidence of someone expecting a positive result. Laura even reached for her purse as if preparing for the moment the documents would be signed. Watching them stirred a mixture of emotions in me that are difficult to explain even now. There was sadness, of course, a deep recognition that the people I once guided through childhood had grown into adults I no longer fully understood. But there was also something else. Not satisfaction exactly, more like the steady certainty that truth was moving toward them step by step, and there was no reason to rush it. Then the lawyer reached the section near the end. I saw the moment before anyone else did. His voice slowed slightly, not because the words were confusing, but because they were unexpected. He adjusted the page with a small movement of his hand. For a second, his eyes flicked toward me, and I gave the smallest nod. That was all the confirmation he needed. He cleared his throat gently and continued reading. The room, which had slowly relaxed over the past few minutes, grew still again without anyone consciously realizing why. The line itself wasn't long. In fact, it was probably the shortest statement in the entire document. But sometimes the smallest sentences carry the heaviest meaning. He read that while all listed assets would indeed pass to my children, the transfer would occur only after one specific condition had been fulfilled. Michael's eyebrows drew together slightly. Laura's hand paused halfway inside her purse. Ben straightened in his chair. The lawyer continued calmly, explaining that the condition required my children to live in the family home together without selling it or dividing the property for 1 full year after my passing, not visiting, living there, sharing the responsibilities, the maintenance, the daily reality of the place their father and I had built together. The rule also included something else. During that year, they would not receive the savings or the proceeds from any assets. Everything would remain untouched until the year was complete. Only then would the inheritance become fully theirs.
At first, the room stayed silent in that strange way people do when they believe they must have misunderstood something. Michael leaned forward again, this time not with excitement, but with confusion tightening his expression. Laura slowly removed her hand from her purse and looked at the lawyer as if waiting for clarification that never came. Then blinked twice, then glanced toward me for the first time since the reading began. The lawyer finished the sentence and set the paper down gently on the table. The silence that followed felt thicker than before. I could hear the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the office. Michael spoke first. He asked the lawyer to repeat that part again, certain there had been a mistake. The lawyer politely reread the same line, word for word, no change. The reactions were subtle at first. That's the thing people misunderstand about shocking moments. They rarely begin with shouting. They begin with disbelief trying to rearrange reality. Michael leaned back slowly, processing the information like someone examining a puzzle piece that didn't fit where expected. Laura looked from him to me, searching our faces for signs that this was some temporary misunderstanding. Ben ran a hand across the back of his neck, his earlier confidence gone. I watched them quietly, not with anger, but with the same patient observation that had guided me through the past few weeks. Because the truth was, the condition itself was not cruel, it wasn't impossible, it simply required them to experience the home not as something to sell or divide, but as something to live inside together the way a family once had. Michael finally turned toward me fully. His voice remained controlled, but the strain inside it was obvious. He asked why something like that was included. I answered honestly. I told them that Daniel and I built that house as a place for family, not as a number on a real estate listing. If it was going to pass to them, I wanted them to understand what it meant to care for it together, even briefly. Laura frowned slightly, clearly calculating what a full year of shared living might mean for her routines, her children, her schedule. Ben looked somewhere between uneasy and thoughtful. The lawyer sat quietly, accustomed to witnessing family reactions during readings like this. Then something interesting happened. Michael laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the short, surprised sound people make when a situation suddenly becomes more complicated than they expected. He shook his head and said a full year living together wasn't exactly practical. Laura nodded slightly in agreement. Ben didn't say anything at all. I listened to them without interrupting, because what they were really revealing in that moment wasn't frustration about logistics, it was something deeper. They had imagined inheritance as a transaction that required nothing from them, and now, for the first time, it asked something in return. The lawyer gathered the papers neatly after the discussion quieted down. He explained that everything in the document was legally clear. Nothing had been hidden, nothing had been added without my approval. The final line had always been there, waiting to be read exactly like this. As the weight of that reality settled into the room, I saw something pass across my children's faces that hadn't appeared before. Uncertainty. Not about the money itself, but about me. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, they were realizing they might not have understood their mother nearly as well as they believed. For several long seconds after the lawyer finished explaining, none of my children spoke. The room held that uncomfortable quiet that appears when people are trying to reorganize their thoughts quickly enough to keep control of a situation. Michael was the first to move again. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, fingers laced together in the same posture he used during difficult business conversations. I had seen it many times before when he thought a negotiation was about to begin. He asked the lawyer if the condition could be adjusted. The way he said the word was careful, almost polite, but the meaning underneath it was obvious. He believed there must still be room to correct what he saw as a problem. The lawyer didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward me, because ultimately the document reflected my decision. I could feel all three of my children waiting for my reaction. I shook my head gently before the lawyer even needed to speak. It wasn't a dramatic refusal, just a calm confirmation that what had been written was intentional. Michael's lips pressed together, and I saw the shift happen behind his eyes. The conversation he had expected to end with signatures and relief had suddenly turned into something unfamiliar. Laura cleared her throat and tried a softer approach. She said living together for a year sounded complicated. She mentioned work schedules, children, space, routines. Her voice carried the tone of someone explaining practical obstacles rather than challenging the idea directly. But beneath those words was another message. This wasn't what they had planned for. Ben finally spoke then, quieter than the other two. He asked why exactly that condition mattered so much. His question didn't sound angry, just puzzled, like he was trying to see the logic from my side. I appreciated that, even if the others didn't. I took my time answering, not to create suspense, but because some explanations deserve careful words. I told them something simple. I said that houses are strange things. From the outside, they look like walls and windows, but inside they carry years of invisible moments. Every celebration, every argument, every ordinary morning when someone makes coffee while another person complains about being late for school. Daniel and I spent most of our lives inside that home with them. The idea of it instantly turning into numbers on a document never felt right to me. Michael sighed quietly, and I could see he was already calculating the inconvenience of what I was asking. Laura looked thoughtful, but uneasy. Ben kept watching me closely. I continued speaking before anyone interrupted. I told them a year living together there wasn't punishment, it was perspective, a chance to remember what the place actually meant before it became something else. Michael leaned back again, this time rubbing his forehead slowly. The confidence he had carried into the office earlier was fading, replaced with frustration he was trying to keep hidden. He said people had lives now, responsibilities, families of their own. Moving into one house together like that wasn't realistic. The words came out faster the longer he spoke, as though convincing himself while also trying to persuade me. Laura nodded beside him, adding that her kids were settled in school. Changing everything for a year would be disruptive. Ben remained silent again, but I noticed he hadn't disagreed with the idea outright. That small detail stayed with me. The lawyer finally spoke, gently reminding everyone that the condition only applied if they wanted to receive the full inheritance. Technically, they were free to refuse. In that case, the estate would be directed elsewhere according to the document's instructions. That sentence changed the air in the room immediately. Michael's head lifted sharply. Laura blinked in surprise, then shifted in his chair. None of them had considered that possibility. They had been focused only on adjusting the rules, not imagining a world where the rules stayed exactly as they were. Michael asked what elsewhere meant, and the lawyer calmly pointed to another paragraph farther down the page. He didn't read it aloud yet, but the mere existence of it unsettled them. For the first time since the meeting began, all three of my children looked directly at me with the same question in their eyes. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something closer to disbelief, the quiet realization that the situation was more complex than they had assumed. I held their gaze calmly. There was no reason to rush explanations. People listen more carefully when they understand something important might be at stake. Michael asked if I really expected them to rearrange their entire lives for this. His voice carried a sharper edge now. I answered honestly again. I said I expected them to decide what mattered most to them. That was all. Laura let out a slow breath and leaned back in her chair. I could almost see the thoughts moving behind her eyes. Schedules, logistics, inconvenience, but also the number she likely imagined receiving once everything was finalized. Then looked down at the table, thinking quietly. But Michael was beginning to understand something deeper. He studied my face for a long moment, like someone realizing a familiar landscape hid layers he never noticed before. Then he asked a question that told me exactly where his mind had gone. He asked if this was some kind of test. I didn't answer right away, because in a way it was, but not the kind he meant. I hadn't written that condition to trap them or embarrass them. I wrote it because time reveals people more honestly than arguments ever could. Living under one roof again, even briefly, would show them things about each other they'd long forgotten. It might remind them what family actually requires beyond shared DNA, or it might confirm something else entirely. Either way, the truth would become impossible to ignore. The lawyer checked the time and asked if we wanted to continue reviewing the final paragraphs or pause for the day. Michael said he wanted to hear the rest now. His tone carried determination mixed with unease. Laura nodded slowly, then agreed quietly. I could sense all of them realizing that the document in front of us held more surprises than expected. The lawyer turned the page carefully. Paper rustled softly in the quiet office. Then he began reading again, and as he approached the final section, I noticed something that almost made me smile. The confidence my children carried into the room earlier had completely disappeared. In its place was attention, real attention, because for the first time since Daniel's funeral, they were finally listening to their mother.
The lawyer adjusted the final pages and began reading again. Slower now, not because the words were difficult, but because everyone in the room had started paying closer attention. The earlier confidence my children carried into the office had dissolved into something more cautious. It's interesting how quickly certainty disappears when people realize they might not know the full story. Michael's posture had changed completely. Instead of leaning back comfortably, he sat forward again, listening carefully. Laura's arms were folded loosely, her eyes moving between the document and my face as if trying to read both at the same time. Ben, who had been the quietest, seemed the most focused of all. The lawyer explained that if the one-year condition was fulfilled, the estate would be distributed exactly as listed earlier. The house, the savings, the cabin, everything divided equally between them. No tricks, no additional rules, just the arrangement they had originally expected, delayed only by time and cooperation. At first, that seemed to relax them slightly. I could see the thought forming behind Michael's eyes that perhaps the condition, inconvenient as it was, might still be manageable. A year could pass quickly if handled carefully. Laura seemed to be calculating something similar. She uncrossed her arms and leaned toward the table again. Ben nodded faintly, as if acknowledging that the path forward still existed. But the lawyer hadn't finished reading yet, and when he reached the next paragraph, the energy in the room shifted once more. He explained that if the condition was not completed, if the house was sold early, or if they refused to live there together, the entire estate would be transferred to a foundation Daniel and I had quietly supported for years, a local housing charity that helped families who had nowhere else to go. The sentence landed in the room like a stone dropping into still water. Michael blinked in disbelief. Laura's mouth opened slightly before she could stop herself, then looked from the lawyer to me again, this time with genuine surprise instead of confusion. The lawyer calmly finished the paragraph and set the papers down, the same way he had earlier. The difference now was the weight of the silence that followed. A moment earlier, my children had been thinking about how to work around a condition. Now they were realizing that ignoring it meant losing everything entirely. Michael spoke first again, but the confidence in his voice had changed. He asked if the charity clause was serious. The lawyer nodded once, completely serious, fully binding. Laura turned toward me slowly. "You'd really give it all away?" she asked. Her voice carried something between shock and accusation. I met her eyes calmly and answered with the same honesty I had used all day. I told her that Daniel and I had spent years building a life that meant something to us. If our children didn't value it enough to spend 1 year understanding it, then perhaps someone else should benefit from it instead. The words weren't harsh when I spoke them, but they carried a truth that couldn't be softened. Michael let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though there was no humor in it.
He shook his head slowly, trying to process what he had just heard. For the first time, the situation was no longer a simple inconvenience to him. It had become a choice with real consequences. Ben was the one who asked the next question, and his voice was quieter than before. He asked when Daniel and I had decided to include that charity. I felt a small ache in my chest hearing Daniel's name spoken like that again. I explained that we had supported the organization privately for years, long before anyone thought about inheritance or legal documents. Daniel believed strongly that homes should be places of stability, not just assets. After he passed, I had spent many nights thinking about what would honor that belief. Eventually, the answer became clear. The house had already given our family decades of memories. If it could also help others someday, then the life Daniel built wouldn't simply end with paperwork. Michael rubbed his hands together slowly, the way people do when they're trying to slow their thoughts down. I could see frustration rising in him, but it was tangled with something else now, uncertainty about how to respond without sounding selfish. Laura looked at the floor briefly before speaking again. She said it felt like pressure, like the decision had been designed to force them into something unrealistic. I listened without interrupting, because from their perspective, that was exactly how it felt. What they hadn't considered was how the situation had looked from mine over the past few months. The quiet conversations, the assumptions, the way the house had slowly turned into a prize rather than a place. The lawyer remained silent, letting the family conversation unfold. He was likely seen similar moments many times. Michael finally looked directly at me again and asked why I hadn't told them about this earlier. I thought about that question carefully before answering. I told him something very simple, because if I had explained everything ahead of time, the conversation would have been about convincing me to change it. This way, they were hearing the decision exactly as it existed, clear, complete, and impossible to reshape through persuasion. The honesty of that answer seemed to land harder than anything else I had said. Laura leaned back again, staring at the ceiling for a moment, as if hoping the answer might somehow change if she gave it enough time. Ben looked thoughtful rather than angry, though the surprise still lingered in his expression. Michael tapped his fingers once against the table, then stopped himself. None of them had expected their mother to quietly outmaneuver the assumptions they had been making for weeks. After a while, the lawyer gently asked if they wanted time to think before signing anything. No decisions had to be made that minute. The document would remain exactly the same regardless of how long they considered it. Michael nodded slowly, clearly realizing that rushing would not help. Laura agreed under her breath. Ben simply said yes. Chairs moved slightly as everyone shifted their weight, the tension in the room settling into something quieter but far more serious than before. As we prepared to leave the office, I watched my children carefully. The excitement they carried earlier was gone, replaced by deep thought. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, they were not speaking about the inheritance like a guaranteed outcome. They were thinking about what it would actually require from them. And as I walked toward the door together, I realized something important. The real shock of this story hadn't even happened yet, because the most powerful moment wasn't when the lawyer read the condition. It would come later, when my children finally decided what mattered more to them, the life waiting outside that house or the truth waiting inside it. We walked out of the lawyer's office far more quietly than we had entered. Earlier that morning, there had been an invisible excitement guiding my children forward, the quiet certainty that everything was about to fall neatly into place. Now, the air around us felt heavier, filled with thoughts none of them were ready to say aloud yet. In the parking lot, we paused beside our cars like people unsure which direction the conversation should go next. Michael finally broke the silence, saying everyone probably needed time to think. Laura agreed quickly. Ben simply nodded. No one argued, no one laughed. The entire mood of the day had shifted from expectation to calculation. I watched them carefully, noticing something that had been missing for weeks. For the first time since Daniel passed away, they were no longer speaking to me like the ending of the story had already been decided. Over the next few days, the phone calls began again, but they were different now, slower, more cautious. Michael called first, late in the evening after most people would have already finished dinner. His voice carried that controlled tone he used whenever he was trying to keep emotions from interfering with logic. He said he had been thinking a lot about the condition, about the house, about the year. He asked questions in a careful order, as if approaching the subject from every possible angle would reveal a loophole somewhere. Could the year be split between them? Could they rotate months? Could certain exceptions apply if work schedules became difficult? I listened patiently, letting him finish each idea before answering, and each time my answer remained the same. The house had to be lived in together, as a family. That was the condition. At first, he sounded frustrated, but underneath the frustration, I could hear something else slowly growing, curiosity mixed with disbelief. Michael had spent most of his life being able to solve problems through negotiation. Now he had encountered something that refused to bend simply because it was inconvenient. Before ending the call, he asked one final question. He asked if I really meant it about the charity. I told him yes, completely. The silence on the line after that lasted longer than anything else we had said. Laura called the next afternoon. Her voice was softer than Michael's had been, but also more unsettled. She spoke about practical things at first, the way people often circle a difficult topic before approaching it directly. Her children's school schedules, her husband's job, the distance between her home and mine. Eventually, she admitted something that surprised me slightly. She said she had driven past the house earlier that day just to look at it again. She told me it felt strange imagining herself living there like she had when she was young. For a moment, her voice carried a hint of nostalgia I hadn't heard in years. But the feeling didn't stay long. Soon, the conversation returned to the same concern, whether the condition could somehow be reconsidered. When I gently told her it couldn't, she sighed quietly. Not angrily, just heavily, like someone realizing the situation was real. Ben didn't call until 2 days later. When he finally did, his tone was different from the other two entirely. Instead of starting with objections, he asked me about the house itself, small things, whether the old oak tree in the backyard was still standing strong, whether the upstairs hallway still creaked near the bathroom door, whether Daniel's workshop in the garage had been left the same. His questions caught me off guard at first, but as we talked, I realized something important. Ben wasn't trying to negotiate the condition. He was remembering the place. After a while, he admitted he had stopped by there too, just like Laura had. He had sat in his car for a few minutes before leaving. I asked him what he was thinking about while he sat there. He laughed quietly and said he wasn't completely sure. Maybe childhood, maybe Dad, maybe the way things used to feel simpler before everyone started living separate lives. That conversation stayed with me long after we hung up, because for the first time since the lawyer's office, I sensed that the condition had started doing exactly what it was meant to do. It wasn't about forcing them into inconvenience. It was about slowing them down long enough to actually look at what they had been so eager to claim. The house wasn't just a structure waiting to be divided. It held pieces of their lives they had quietly walked away from. A week passed before we all spoke together again. Michael suggested meeting at the house itself to talk things through. The suggestion surprised me, but I agreed. When the day arrived, I unlocked the front door and stepped inside first, just as I had thousands of times before. The familiar smell of wood polish and old books filled the air. Sunlight fell across the living room floor in the same soft pattern it always had in the afternoon. For a moment, I could almost imagine Daniel sitting in his chair by the window again. Then I heard the front door open behind me. Michael entered first, looking around like someone revisiting a place from a different lifetime. Laura followed, her eyes moving slowly across the walls where photographs still hung. Ben stepped in last and closed the door quietly behind him. None of them spoke for a moment. Houses do that to people sometimes. They hold echoes strong enough to silence even the busiest minds. Eventually, Michael cleared his throat and said we should sit down. We gathered around the same dining table where countless family meals had once taken place. The chairs made the same soft scraping sound across the floor they always had. The conversation that followed wasn't the argument I expected. In fact, it began strangely calm. Michael admitted the condition had caught them off guard. Laura said she had spent the week trying to figure out how it could work. Ben simply listened. I told them again that the decision was theirs, no pressure, no deadline, just a choice. If they wanted the inheritance, they could live there together for a year. If not, the charity would receive everything and help families who truly needed homes. Michael looked around the dining room slowly after I said that. His gaze paused on the old scratch marks in the wood left by years of plates and homework pencils. Laura followed his eyes, then looked toward the kitchen doorway where she used to stand talking with me while dinner cooked. Ben leaned back slightly, staring up at the ceiling light fixture Daniel installed himself years ago. Something quiet moved through the room then. Not agreement, not resistance, something deeper, recognition. Finally, Michael spoke again, but this time his voice was different from any I had heard from him in weeks. He said the three of them needed to talk privately before making any decisions. I nodded and stood up from the table. As I walked toward the living room, I heard their chairs shift behind me as they leaned closer together. Their voices lowered into a murmur I couldn't quite hear. And sitting there by the window where Daniel once spent his evenings, I realized something important about what was happening in that dining room. For the first time in a very long time, my children were actually talking to each other like family again.
From the living room, I could hear their voices blending together in low, serious conversation, not loud enough to make out every word, but clear enough to know the discussion was real. For years, I had watched my children move through life separately, each busy with their own responsibilities, their own homes, their own schedules. Family gatherings had become shorter, more formal, almost like appointments. Now, in the next room, they were leaning toward each other again, speaking in the same house where they had once argued over toys and television channels and who forgot to wash the dishes. I sat quietly in Daniel's old chair and let the sound of their voices drift through the hallway. In a strange way, that moment alone made the entire situation worth it. Time passed slowly. The afternoon light shifted across the floor, climbing higher up the wall as the sun moved. Once or twice their voices rose slightly, then softened again. It wasn't a fight. It sounded more like people trying to figure out something they hadn't expected to face. Eventually, the murmur stopped. Chairs moved. Footsteps approached the living room. I looked up as the three of them stepped in together. Their expressions weren't identical, but they shared something new I hadn't seen in weeks: seriousness without calculation. Michael spoke first, though not in the confident tone he had used earlier in the lawyer's office. This time his voice carried the weight of someone who had been forced to think honestly. He said they had talked through every option they could imagine: work schedules, families, the logistics of living together again after so many years apart. Laura nodded beside him, adding that it wouldn't be easy. Ben stood slightly behind them, but his eyes met mine steadily. Michael continued, explaining that the first reaction all of them had was to reject the idea completely. A year sounded like too much, too disruptive, too strange.
but the longer they talked, the more the conversation shifted. At some point, the question stopped being, how do we avoid this, and became something else entirely. It became, why does Mom want this so much? Hearing him say that made something inside my chest loosen slightly, because that question meant they had finally stepped outside their expectations long enough to consider my perspective. Laura took a breath and admitted that she had walked through the house earlier while they were talking. She said the rooms felt smaller than she remembered, but somehow fuller too, like every corner still held pieces of their childhood. Ben gave a small smile at that and said the creak in the upstairs hallway was still there exactly the same. Michael shook his head slightly, almost amused by himself, and said he had forgotten how loud the old refrigerator sounded at night. The three of them shared a brief glance that carried memories none of them had planned on revisiting that day. Then Michael looked back at me and said something that mattered more than the decision itself. He said that for the past few weeks they had all been thinking about the house the wrong way. They had treated it like something waiting to be claimed instead of something that had already given them years of life. Laura nodded slowly, clearly uncomfortable admitting it, but unwilling to deny it either. Ben crossed his arms lightly and said sometimes people don't realize what a place means until they're forced to slow down and look at it again. The silence that followed wasn't tense anymore. It was thoughtful. Finally, Michael said they had reached a decision together. He didn't rush the words, which told me how carefully they had been considered. He said they would do it. They would live in the house for the year. Laura laughed softly right after he said it, though it wasn't a happy laugh exactly, more like disbelief at the idea of the three of them suddenly sharing a roof again after so long. Ben shrugged slightly and said it might be chaos, but at least it would be honest chaos. I felt many emotions hearing that answer. Relief, yes, but also something deeper than relief. A quiet confirmation that the people sitting in front of me were still capable of reflection, even if it took a difficult situation to reach it. I told them the decision was theirs and that I wouldn't interfere with how they managed it. Michael nodded and said he understood. Laura looked around the living room again, as if trying to imagine how daily life there might feel. Ben walked over to the window and glanced outside toward the backyard, where the old oak tree stood exactly where it always had. We spent the next hour talking in a way we hadn't for years, not about money or documents, but about memories tied to each room. Laura reminded us of the time the kitchen flooded because someone forgot to turn off the sink. Ben brought up the summer nights we slept with the windows open because the air conditioner had broken. Michael even laughed about the dent he put in the hallway wall when he was 14. Each story carried Daniel's presence quietly through the house, like he was still part of the conversation, even though his chair sat empty. Eventually, the evening light began fading. My children gathered their things and prepared to leave, though the mood felt entirely different from the earlier meetings at the lawyer's office. Before walking out, Michael paused near the door and looked back at me. He said something simple that I will probably remember for the rest of my life. He said, "Mom, I think Dad would have liked this." Laura placed a hand on my shoulder briefly, her expression softer than it had been in months. Then gave me a small nod that didn't need words. Then they stepped outside together. After the door closed, the house returned to its familiar quiet, but the silence didn't feel empty this time. I walked slowly through the rooms, turning on lamps as the evening settled in. The same furniture stood where it always had. The same photographs lined the hallway, yet something inside the house had shifted, almost like it had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. I sat down again in Daniel's chair and looked toward the dining room where my children had talked together earlier. And for the first time since his funeral, I felt certain about something. People often think this story is about revenge, about a clever line in a legal document that shocked a greedy family, but that's not the truth. The truth is much quieter than that. I didn't want to punish my children. I wanted them to remember what family actually feels like before life turns everything into transactions. Whether they spend that year arguing, laughing, or rediscovering things they forgot doesn't matter as much as the fact that they chose to try. Because in the end, the most valuable thing Daniel and I ever built wasn't the house. It was the chance for our children to find their way back to each other inside it.